Investigators in Canada are on the trail of a killer. The key lies in the victim's cells. But has fire destroyed all the evidence? At a murder scene, a handful of cigarettes provides the only clue. Will forensic detectives be able to unlock their secret? This young man was imprisoned for a rape he swears he didn't commit. Can science prove he's innocent? When police are stumped, they may turn to detectives in lab coats to uncover clues hidden inside the human cell. One strand of DNA can finger a killer or set the innocent free. The new shape of crime detection is a double helix. In July 1991, a janitor in Vancouver, British Columbia made a routine trip to the dumpster. But what he found was far from routine. Inside lay a body burned so completely he wasn't sure it was human. He ran to call police. Across town, detectives Al Catley and Rick Crook responded to the call. The homicide investigators had done this drill before. What may look like a human body sometimes turns out to be a practical joke, a discarded mannequin, or some other case of mistaken identity. They hoped that was all it was. Still, they had to check it out.
So when we walked over to take a look at inside the dumpster, there was just the outline of a human body. And in fact, it was so badly destroyed by the fire that it was questionable as to whether it was human, or we've had some instances of bear carcasses being destroyed after illegal hunting or something like that. And we didn't rule out that possibility.
You can't.
No.
The thing is, though,
The officers approached the dumpster carefully, making note of details that could become important later. The dumpster was cool to the touch when they arrived. The fire had been out for hours. A stain spread from the corner onto the pavement. Whoever set the blaze used more than enough flammable liquid to destroy the contents. A close inspection of the contents confirmed that this was no false alarm. There, amid the ashes of computer boxes, wooden flats, and scrap paper, lay a human body. After the detectives made their notes, the delicate removal of the fragile evidence began. It was gently placed in a body bag so as not to damage it any further. Then it went to the morgue, where a pathologist would examine the body for clues to its identity. Anything else that survived the blaze was also collected and sealed.
not surprising. No.
Surveying the scene, the detectives realized the murderer selected his site carefully. An industrial park closed for the weekend, surrounded by brush and trees.
In fact, we did establish that people were driving by roughly the time that we think that the homicide occurred, or the burning occurred, and there wasn't anything. You could have quite easily have driven up here and probably out without really seeing what you would have thought was a fire.
Homicides are often solved in the first 24 hours when investigators follow hot leads. But in this case, the fire had gone out. The trail had grown cold. If the murder happened just 5 years earlier, Crook and Catley would have relied solely on hunches and their talent for bulldogging a case until they had the answers. But by 1991, when this victim died, Crook and Catley knew they had an ally in the lab. A powerful new tool had been added to crime solving: DNA profiling. investigators no longer needed a shred of evidence to solve a case. They only needed a single cell. As personal as the whorls and lines of a fingerprint, but far more difficult to hide, DNA is the next wave in scientific sleuthing. Today, scientists can extract DNA on a sweat-stained hat left by a nervous killer, from saliva on the stamp of an extortionist's letter, or from dried blood or skin scraped from underneath a victim's fingernails. Microscopic evidence has always been left behind by criminals. Only with the advent of DNA profiling has it become incriminating. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, contains every detail that makes you human.
Back to where it was.
No two people, except identical twins, share the same patterns. DNA is small enough to fit inside the nucleus of every cell. Its shape is a double helix, like a spiral staircase wrapped around a column. Uncoiled, the double helix would stretch to 8 feet. About 99.5% of everyone's DNA is the same, but some sections vary greatly from person to person. By studying those sections, scientists can identify victims and unmask murderers. In the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Paul Ferrara runs one of the most progressive DNA testing labs in the country.
With the sensitivity of this technology, I don't know that I could go in and commit a violent crime and just not somehow leave something of me behind. And that's all it takes with this technology, just some little piece of me that's got a cell with a nucleus in it, and I'm in deep trouble.
Heat is the enemy of DNA, and fire is the bane of forensic investigators who try to recover DNA from torched crime scenes. A week after the victim was found, Crook and firefighters recreated the inferno to see if it could shed some light on the crime. Whether by design or accident, the killer left one lid open, creating a downdraft inside the dumpster. The rushing air whipped the flames into a frenzy. The surrounding trees hid what little smoke the fire produced. It burned at about 2,000 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes. By comparison, a crematorium burns between 1,000 to 1,400 degrees for about 3 hours. Police were lucky to have any remains at all. Now they had to figure out who was killed here. All the pathologist could tell them was that the victim was a white female. Traditional methods at a standstill, detectives focused on X-rays. They showed the victim was shot in the head, but they also revealed a feature detectives hoped would identify her. David Sweet, a forensic odontologist or dental investigator, worked on the case. Teeth are the hardest substance in the human body and the most difficult to destroy. When bodies can't be easily identified, odontologists look to the teeth to tell them about the victim. Their wear and condition can hold the story of a person's life, whether they were right or left-handed, drank water with fluoride as a child, or wore braces. By studying the victim's teeth, it was determined that she was in her early 20s. She had one extraordinary feature.
But the other thing that we realized when we examined the teeth was there was an extra tooth right in the center of the upper jaw between the upper central incisors. And those showed up very well in the x-rays that were taken after the victim died.
Crook ran a computer search that compared his findings with dental records of missing persons. None matched. Despite his best efforts, Crook was stymied. He still had a victim without a name and a murder without a suspect. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, a killer ran free, confident nothing could link him to his crime. What he didn't know was that a small piece of evidence could provide the missing link.
That looks great.
Oh, you cheated.
For 2 days, Detective Al Catley chased a ghost.
Good, good. And yourself?
Who was the woman in the
Karen, I'll tell you
dumpster?
what we had.
What awful chain of events led to her murder? Surely by now someone, a friend, a lover, a co-worker, was missing her. Catley asked his staff for missing persons reports. One stood out. Lynn Breeden, age 30. Her roommate filed the report. He had dropped her off at a friend's house. The friend saw her leaving a nightclub around 3 a.m. the night before the burned woman was found. She left with an unknown man. 3 days later, a woman posing as Lynn Breeden tried to empty her bank account. The woman presented a withdrawal slip with Breeden's account number.
Hi, I need to make a withdrawal.
Okay.
The teller knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. When she questioned the imposter,
And
the
she's
woman
been out of
became
town. She asked
flustered.
me just to withdraw some money so I could pay some bills for her. Take the ID.
When the teller tried to detain the woman, she hurried out.
No, I need you to stay here.
Wait, I gotta go.
No, I need you to stay here.
A security camera captured the failed transaction. Analysis of the film revealed a man waiting for the woman in the parking lot. Police made a photo of the woman from the tape and ran it in the newspaper. She was identified and called in for questioning. She told police a friend had offered her $500 to scam the bank. She knew nothing of the murder. The friend was Chris Cruz, an exotic dancer who used the stage name Tony Devons. Detectives placed him under constant surveillance, then asked him to come in to speak with police.
Homicide squad.
Not realizing police were watching him, Cruz parked his car 2 blocks from the station and walked the rest of the way.
Serious criminal matter.
The surveillance officers called Sergeant Crook to tell him they thought Cruz must be hiding something in his car.
In the 400 block Main Street.
When Cruz arrived at the station, police asked if they could search his car. He told them the car was at his parents' in another county.
You do have the keys and I want them.
They knew he was lying. They told him they knew where he parked it, and they didn't need his permission to search it. Reluctantly, he handed over the keys. Forensic investigators took pictures of the car from every angle, carefully recording what they saw before touching it. They moved in closer to gather more evidence, collecting and photographing virtually everything. It was too soon to tell what might be important later. The men worked in teams. Some officers inspected the evidence, while others marked where it was found. Investigators found bloodstains on the sides and rear of the car. They marked the positions carefully. Later, the shape of the stains would be analyzed to calculate what direction the blood came from and its point of origin. These details are crucial for reconstructing a crime. Blood samples may also be collected for DNA analysis. Police searched the car inside and out. They looked through personal items in the back seat, hoping to find any piece of evidence to tie the victim to the car.
All right, it's 10:05. We're going into the trunk.
Next, they opened the trunk.
Oh, look at this right off the bat.
Inside, they found a gas can and other objects covered with blood.
Get a shot. One moment.
Beneath some clothing, they found several key pieces of evidence: a bloody tire iron and a .22 caliber rifle.
I'd say that's the
The
deal.
detectives now were almost certain Cruz killed Lynn Breeden, but they had no way of connecting the suspect to the victim. Cruz denied knowing her. He told friends he bought her identification on the black market, and police couldn't prove the blood on the car was hers. They needed to compare the DNA from the blood on the car to DNA from the victim. But where could they find the victim's DNA? They turned to David Sweet for help. He suggested looking for it in her impacted wisdom teeth. No one had ever tried it before, but it was their last hope.
We know theoretically that there are cells still embedded in the mineral tissues of the teeth, and we should be able to open the teeth, extract those cellular materials, and extract the DNA from the cells, and then process it in a forensic DNA analysis.
A tooth is an armor coating that surrounds a core of living tissue. Sweet hoped the tissue within the impacted wisdom teeth were protected from the fire by the thick jawbones surrounding them. He cut the first wisdom tooth from crown to root, but found no tissue inside. His second attempt was more successful. He found tissue, but he didn't know if its DNA was destroyed by the fire. He sent it to the lab to be tested. All he could do was wait.
Okay.
Did Chris Cruz kill Lynn Breeden? The answer was in a forensic lab in Vancouver, where the victim's tissue was sent for testing. Finally, Dr. Sweet received the results. The DNA survived the fire. What's more, further testing showed the DNA from the victim matched the DNA from the blood in Cruz's car. The lab calculated the odds that it wasn't the victim's blood were 1 in 540 million. Dr. Sweet proved that Lynn Breeden was in the car the night she died. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Chris Cruz confessed to murder. Based on interviews, detectives pieced together a likely scenario of that fatal night. Breeden once borrowed a great deal of money from Cruz. Now he wanted to collect. Breeden refused to pay him. Cruz lost his temper. Growing impatient, she got out of his car. Cruz beat her, shoved her body in the trunk, and drove to the dumpster. After he arrived at the secluded spot, the victim began to regain consciousness. Chris Cruz shot her. He thought the flames would erase all the evidence. How could he know the charge of murder would come from his victim's own mouth? Found guilty of second-degree murder, Chris Cruz received a life sentence. In rural Clay County, Alabama, a drive along Route 31 leads to a town caught between memories and progress, where turn-of-the-century storefronts share billing with a new city hall, where folks still get their news word of mouth, and where bad news and good news travel at about the same speed. Summertime slow. It's a safe place where parents don't think twice about giving their teenagers free rein to explore the land. A place where violence is an unwelcome stranger. On July 22nd, 1995, 3 riders on all-terrain vehicles discovered a burned mattress in the woods, and beneath it, what appeared to be blackened bones. They contacted Sheriff Ralph Toland, who responded to the call.
You think you've got a body? 3 miles. 3 miles east of 4977 intersection. Okay, we'll be on our way.
The men met the sheriff and led him to their grim discovery. It looked like murder. Toland began to secure the crime scene, but knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to be sure no evidence was jeopardized.
I got down into the scene and I saw exactly what had happened. Saw the mattress charred and burned, nothing left but the springs over a skeleton. I just stopped everybody where they were at and told them to stop right there. Had them to go back out to the entrance from the road and asked them all just to secure it. I wanted forensic and the criminalist to come and help us collect all the evidence.
The man he wanted was Angelo Dellamana. A scientist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, Dellamana never knows what he's going to find when he answers a call.
Whenever you get to a crime scene, you hope that it's been secure and cordoned off right after the discovery of the body. You don't want anybody into the crime scene that doesn't belong there. You don't want anybody messing up evidence. You want the evidence to be maintained in a secure fashion so that when you as a scientist get there to recover it, you can collect it without disturbing it, preserve it, bring it back to the laboratory, and do the tests that you need on it to find out who did the crime.
Dellamana marked the position of the body, the condition of the mattress and the surrounding area before he went to work collecting everything he could. Dellamana placed flags to mark the position of what little evidence he found. He marked 11 used cigarettes randomly scattered around the mattress. They hadn't been there long. That was a good sign. But who smoked them? The killer? The victim?
I felt it was going to be very hard not only to identify that person, but to generate some kind of evidence. I did feel at the crime scene that the cigarette butts present there were going to be very strong evidence because they did not look weathered. They were sitting up on top of the cushion of grass. I felt they had not been there very long.
As Dellamana assessed the situation, his technicians recorded the evidence. Since technicians don't want to leave part of themselves behind, they wear gloves. Dellamana's people had been trained so they don't unwittingly destroy the very clues that they're trying to save. If forensic scientists are careless in how they collect, store, or process evidence, they'll leave themselves vulnerable to attack in the courtroom. After the evidence was marked, photographed, and recorded, technicians carefully collected it. Bodies don't just turn up without someone missing them. Sheriff Toland already had a sinking suspicion about who the victim was. The week before, Jimmy Paris called him to report that his wife, Peggy Laughlin, was missing. Sheriff Toland decided it was time for his deputies to pay Paris a call.
You can't think of anywhere else she might have gone?
It was no secret around town that the couple had more than their share of knockdown, drag-out fights. No one would be surprised if Peggy just decided to up and leave. Meanwhile, the medical examiner compared the victim's backbone to spinal x-rays of Peggy Laughlin. They matched. Jimmy Paris became the prime suspect. But where was the evidence? Paris denied being anywhere near the woods that night. Delamanna tried to put the pieces together, but he didn't have enough of them to complete the picture. The forensics team turned up nothing at the crime scene. The cigarettes were the only clue untouched by the fire. The answer must lie with them. Detectives told him both Peggy and Jimmy smoked.
You can be looking at a case and feel going in that there isn't very much evidence there. The investigators don't think there's very much there to work with. But when you, as a forensic scientist, find that small piece of evidence, that one link that can either nail the suspect or clear a falsely accused individual, the rush that comes from that makes all the long hours worthwhile.
If he could lift DNA from the cigarette filters, he could compare it to the DNA of Paris and Laughlin. If he could prove they were together in the woods, Toland could make a case against Paris. Delamanna shined an ultraviolet light on the cigarettes. The light revealed the saliva-soaked areas. DNA can be obtained from saliva and lip cells. He marked the outline of the glowing portion he wanted to test. Then he carefully trimmed it away and sent it to the lab for DNA profiling.
To build a DNA profile, what we do first is we take our evidence sample, blood or saliva or whatever the DNA is in. Okay, what we do is we break open the cell and release the DNA. So we extract the DNA from whatever it's on. We clean it up and we look at specific areas or addresses on the DNA, and we make millions of copies of that area big enough so that we can see it. Once the DNA profile is done for each person in the case, we can then compare it to the evidence DNA profile and see if there's any matches there at all.
He was encouraged by the results. The lab identified DNA from 2 people, and 2 of the cigarettes held DNA from both people, meaning they shared their smokes. Could Delamanna prove those 2 people were Jimmy Paris and Peggy Laughlin? Testing Paris's DNA was simple. Cooperating with police, he gave a blood sample, which provided ample DNA to analyze. But getting Laughlin's DNA proved much more difficult. Delamanna had to try extracting it from her remains. He felt the best place to look for the DNA was in the marrow of the femur, or thigh bone. The largest bone in the body, it's the one most likely to have protected DNA from the fire. Bone marrow is rich in DNA. To expose as many cells as possible, Delamanna ground it into a powder. He gave the powder to another scientist for DNA extraction. The scientist places the powder into a chemical bath that breaks open the cell's nuclei, releasing the DNA. Once the DNA is in the solution, bone fragments, chemicals, and impurities must be removed. The liquid goes through a series of microscopic filters. A centrifuge spins away the refuse. The filters trap the clean DNA. Theoretically, scientists can obtain DNA from just one cell. But to create a profile, they generally need thousands, though that number is decreasing. Not long ago, tests required a sample the size of a dime. Today, they can extract usable DNA from a drop of blood the size of a pinhead. The DNA is isolated. Now it's time to measure it. When the DNA is drawn through a membrane, it creates a band of color. By comparing the color, scientists can determine how much DNA they have. Delamanna examines the results, which appear as small dark bands on a piece of film. DNA is measured in minuscule quantities called nanograms, or billionths of a gram. The test results tell Delamanna whether he has enough DNA to work with.
Unfortunately, there's only about 0.3 nanograms of DNA in that sample. That's point and then 9 zeros and a 3 grams of DNA in that sample.
Delamanna didn't have enough usable DNA for testing. But he had an ace up his sleeve, a scientific process so revolutionary, its inventor, Carrie B. Mullis, won the Nobel Prize. Up until 1993, scientists could test DNA only if they had large quantities. But bacteria, heat, and time take their toll, degrading DNA and leaving it in fragments. A process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, enables scientists to make multiple copies of DNA. DNA is made up of 4 chemical units: adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, and cytosine, C. These units are strung together like beads. A joins only with T, and G joins only with C. PCR works by splitting apart the double-stranded DNA like a zipper. The thermocycler heats the DNA, separating the A from the T and the G from the C, essentially unzipping the helix down the center. More of these chemicals are added to the solution, and the 2 halves of the helix use them to make themselves whole. Repeat the process, and the 2 become 4, and so on, until millions of copies are created and the sample can be measured. When making a DNA profile, scientists don't need to compare the entire DNA molecule. They only look at several sites along the helix. If these sites are the same on both samples, the DNA most likely came from the same person. It's considered a match. Scientists used PCR to create enough DNA from the bone to do a profile. But the quantity and quality of the DNA was poor, so they could measure only 1 site. But in order to make a match, they needed to identify at least 2 sites. How could they find that second site? Delamanna knew that a child's DNA is a combination of both parents' DNA. To solve Peggy Laughlin's murder, Delamanna needed help from her brothers and sisters. If he could do their profiles, then he could work backward and calculate Peggy's.
Once we knew we didn't have enough DNA to build Peggy's complete DNA profile, we had to go and get a blood sample from every one of her brothers and sisters that were in the United States. These samples came from all over the United States.
As Delamanna's investigation continued, Sheriff Toland received a call about an abandoned van found in a neighboring town. A license check showed it belonged to Jimmy Paris. Inside, forensic scientists found blood on the ceiling and walls. Part of the carpeting had been torn out.
I tell you what, Dan, look above your head, right above your head.
Whoa, yeah.
You got 3.
I see it.
Based on this evidence, they obtained a search warrant for Paris's home.
Hey, Jimmy. Hi. Sorry to bother you, John. You let us in. That help us just fine. Stand aside there, back off with them.
Deputies searched the house for any clues that could link Paris to his wife's death. But they found nothing. Then an officer checked the crawl space and found a section of blood-soaked carpet. It matched the missing piece from Paris's van like a jigsaw puzzle. The possession of the carpet linked Paris to the bloodied van. Police had the murder scene, they had the victim, and they had their suspect. The evidence was strong enough to arrest Jimmy Paris for the murder of his wife. But to strengthen their case for conviction, police needed to link Paris, the van, and the burned mattress together. To do that, Paris had to be placed with the victim just before her death. Angelo Dell'Amana was hard at work trying to accomplish just that. He was ready to make Peggy's DNA profile using the blood samples from her siblings.
We extracted them, put them through our full battery of DNA tests, and what we did was when we got the DNA profiles of the brothers and the sisters, we were able to work backwards and build the rest of Peggy's profile.
The genetic information Dell'Amana gathered from the siblings enabled him to complete the missing link on Peggy's DNA. Peggy's DNA matched the DNA on the cigarettes. Here was proof that Peggy was alive with Jimmy in the woods the night she died. For forensics expert Paul Ferrara, the DNA match was the kind of evidence that tipped the scales against Jimmy Paris.
When looking at DNA evidence and the weight that you put on that DNA evidence, take that and place it in perspective with other evidence of motive, means, and opportunity. And when you combine all of those together, then one can come to an informed opinion that a person is guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Paris had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Peggy Laughlin. He was a jealous man, and he'd begun to suspect Peggy of infidelity. On that night, he invited her into the woods. He brought along a mattress, placing it on the ground and covering it with a blanket. Peggy and Jimmy smoked and talked, casually tossing aside the spent cigarettes. There, in the saliva and lip cells, lay the code of the murderer's identity, waiting to reveal its secret. Then, something happened that triggered a rage that drove Jimmy Paris to homicide.
The baby is crying too.
You just leave the baby.
No, I'm gonna go get the baby. You hear me?
Paris knew he had to destroy the body if he wanted to escape detection. Probably thought that if police couldn't find a body, they couldn't link him to the crime. He couldn't see that the evidence he had already left would be enough to convict him.
DNA analysis was crucial in the sense that it placed both the suspect and victim at the scene together. And in that case, having those small pieces of evidence allowed us to put a guilty man in prison and allow the family to put closure to a terrible incident.
In Alabama and Vancouver, scientists struggled to find DNA evidence to link a killer to his victim. But the power of DNA is not just its ability to put people behind bars. it also holds the key to setting them free. Attorney Barry Scheck, part of O.J. Simpson's criminal defense team, doesn't believe everyone behind bars is guilty. Using DNA, he's making a strong case. Scheck heads the Innocence Project, a program at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York. The program is dedicated to exonerating the innocent through DNA profiling.
Serological Institute. And that they had actually responded, we have something but not enough to test.
Scheck provides the expertise. The students do the legwork, sifting through hundreds of cases, looking for those with the most promise. Once cases are identified, the students investigate whether the evidence still exists. If it does, they see if it can be used for DNA testing.
I don't know. There's nothing in the Redwell 2 yet.
It became clear to us that DNA had the power to go back into old cases, re-examine it, and exonerate people that had been convicted many years ago, that lots of people felt might be innocent.
The Innocence Project helped exonerate 30 of the 40 people released through DNA since the project began in 1992. Today, startling FBI statistics show that 1/4 to 1/3 of all DNA testing at its lab clears a suspect. No one knows how many innocent people remain in prison across the United States, but the Innocence Project is doing its best to find them.
Now we have all these cases of people who have been convicted, who can credibly come forward and say, look, I didn't commit this crime. There was serological evidence that was introduced against me. There was hair evidence that was introduced against me, for example. Please test items in my case. It'll prove me innocent. And that's happening in case after case after case.
What were the circumstances of the identification?
Louise Hochberg is the executive director of the Innocence Project. In 1993, a convict named Troy Webb appealed to her colleagues for help. He trusted DNA to prove he was innocent of rape.
Troy Webb first wrote to us in 1993, and I understand from Troy that the way he got to us was through his cellmate, who apparently was also a client of the Innocence Project.
Webb was arrested in 1988 after a rape victim picked him out of a photo lineup. Eyewitness identification has led to most convictions where defendants were later proved innocent through DNA profiling. Hochberg believed in Webb's innocence, but it would be 3 years before she and her students returned him to his family in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
The principal criteria for us is, number one, can this person make a credible claim of innocence? And number two, the most important, is there biological evidence in the case that we can test, which combined with other factors will be determinative, will prove that this person did not commit the crime for which he or she was convicted.
The Innocence Project had evidence in the case sent to Paul Ferrara's forensic lab in Richmond. There, scientists compared DNA from evidence left at the rape scene to DNA in a blood sample from Troy Webb.
The level of the technology, even 10 years ago, was such that we couldn't eliminate Troy Webb, for example, as the possible contributor of the genetic material. But by the same token, we wouldn't have been able to eliminate a large percent of the population.
Before they could start the testing process, the lab had to retrieve genetic material from evidence stored 7 years earlier. Once it was identified, they had to see if it contained viable DNA. They used an acid test to confirm the biological fluid was present. If the fluid is present, the indicator liquid turns purple. Another method is to use a light source, called an omnichrome, that makes fluids glow. If the scientist is looking for blood to test for DNA, she'll use a chemical called luminol to find it. Luminol can detect the faintest trace of blood, making it especially helpful in instances where blood may have been washed away by rain or where a killer has tried to remove it. In Troy Webb's case, investigators swabbed the evidence from the victim's clothing. The sample would contain the perpetrator's DNA. They'll compare it with Troy's DNA. Comparing DNA is a matter of comparing the lengths of strands of genetic code at specific points on the double helix. Scientists place the DNA sections they want to compare into a gel. The DNA has a negative charge, so scientists can use a positive charge to pull it through the gel. The longer pieces travel more slowly than the shorter pieces, so two pieces of the same length would move the same distance. If the DNA from the evidence and the suspect move the same distance across the gel, scientists know they're the same length and they have a match. If the segments don't move the same distance, they couldn't belong to the same person. The segment lengths can be seen and measured under lights that make the DNA fluoresce. These are the printouts of the actual DNA profiles in the Troy Webb case. They fade with time, so scientists take photographs for a permanent record. Scientists needed to compare only one site on Troy Webb's DNA strand to the DNA from the evidence. If it didn't match, he couldn't have committed the crime.
4.2, 4.3, and the corresponding pattern.
Besides comparing Webb's DNA to the evidence, it's also compared to the DNA of the victim and the rapist. The dot patterns make the differences between the DNA perfectly clear. None of the DNA matches the DNA from the evidence.
This DNA type did not come from Troy Webb, and the true rapist in this case is actually still at large right now.
On September 7th, 1996, the Innocence Project released the results. In Virginia, where new evidence may not be presented more than 21 days after sentencing, the only option was clemency. The governor reviewed the petition and granted the pardon.
There is no greater good that a lawyer can do, in my judgment, than to look back at old cases, and if it can be demonstrated that an injustice was done, to right it.
On October 16, 1996, Troy Webb emerged from prison a free man. The first thing he wanted to do was eat a 7-foot sub from Philadelphia Cold Cuts. He now works at the sub shop. He's made new friends and reestablished a bond with family. He lives with the same faith and hope that kept him going in prison, and he's grateful to the Innocence Project.
They're like family, really, you know, because wasn't for them, I'd probably still be locked up, you know. But they helped me, you know, for free at that, you know. So, couldn't ask for too much more.
All hope is not lost of catching the real rapist. Virginia has amassed the largest database of DNA in the country by collecting blood samples from every convicted felon.
20,000 a year.
Tens of thousands of blood samples pour in every year, creating a backlog of more than 135,000 samples in cold storage. Still, of the nearly 10,000 DNA profiles in the databank, Virginia has already solved 18 crimes by matching DNA from the crime scene. If the DNA from the case can be matched with DNA in the databank, the rapist will be found.
Our DNA databank here was one of the early ones created. I think we had one hit in 1993, none in 1994, and then 5 in 1995, then 12 in 1996 alone. And the database, even in 1996, only numbered less than 9,000 profiles out of those 130,000 samples we have. When we get to the point where we have the convicted felon profiles, all 130,000 of them, the number of these hits is going to skyrocket dramatically until the point at which they are commonplace. If you are innocent of a crime, DNA technology is your best friend, your best ally. But conversely, if you're guilty, it's your worst enemy.
DNA profiling holds tremendous power for a technology still in its infancy. In its first 10 years, the diminutive double helix has quickly become one of the new detective's biggest allies, bringing criminals to justice and delivering justice to the innocent. A mother's search for her daughter spans 2 decades. She no longer knows what her child looks like. Will digital technology help locate her? A man slays his family and vanishes without a trace for 18 years. Can the work of a sculptor flush him out of hiding? 2 hunters stumble across human remains. Can an artist put flesh on the bones and give the victim a name? Forensic artists combine science, intuition, and skill to build likenesses of the murdered and the missing. Their work can reunite families or help solve a murder, creating faces of hope and faces of tragedy. Under a gray Texas sky in the winter of 1994, 2 hunters trespassed on private land outside of Lubbock. But their offense would pale in comparison to what they'd discover that day in remote Yellow House Canyon. They stumbled onto the partial remains of a human skeleton and a white, high-heeled shoe lying nearby. Though alarmed by their discovery, they knew if they called the police, they'd be fined for poaching. The hunters decided to leave the bones for someone else to find. But when they told a friend what they'd seen, he called the sheriff. The hunters agreed to take Deputy Tom Watson of the Lubbock County Sheriff's Department to the site of their find. Watson immediately suspected the remains belonged to a murder victim, dumped in the canyon to conceal the crime. Only the skull and a few bones remained. Over time, animals must have dragged away parts of the body. Watson directed his deputies to tape off a wide area to be searched for more evidence. Once the crime scene had been documented on film, he called in the county pathologist to examine the bones. The pathologist collected the bones and took them back to his lab, where they could be examined for signs of trauma.
I don't believe we have any local people missing.
He confirmed Watson's suspicions. The victim was murdered. The upper part of the skeleton bore multiple stab marks, enough to kill a person several times over. The case was now officially a homicide. Watson returned to the canyon the next day to sweep for more evidence. To capture the killer, he first had to name the victim. But his search uncovered no form of identification. The only clothing was the one shoe. To identify his victim, he desperately needed more to go on.
The first thing we have to do is determine whether it's male, female, and approximate age. Check those statistics against any possible missing persons that we might have locally. If we don't find anything there, then we expand the search out statewide into New Mexico and Oklahoma. And then if we still haven't got her identified, then we go national with it.
The search team recovered more bones and, luckily, almost all of the victim's teeth, but nothing more. No personal effects that could clue them in to who the victim was or when the killing occurred. Watson turned the bones over to a forensic pathologist who was able to narrow down the possibilities. He concluded that the victim was a white female, 18 to 24 years old. The weathering on the bones suggested she'd been dead at least 2 years. Tooth fillings in the lower jaw and a crown in the upper jaw offered more identifying features. The teeth were x-rayed so they could be compared to dental charts of missing white females of the same age. Using the x-rays, Watson began a search to make a match. He chased dozens of leads, some from as far as New Jersey, but none matched the dental records of the woman found in Yellow House Canyon. His investigation was leading nowhere. Meanwhile, a killer remained free. Watson needed more than the victim's bones and teeth to identify her. He needed to give the woman a face. For that, he turned to one of America's leading experts on facial reconstruction. Karen Taylor has worked for the Texas Department of Public Safety in Austin for 16 years. As a forensic artist, she helps identify skeletons by recreating what the person looked like when alive. Her images are distributed by police and the media in the hopes that the remains will be identified. Using techniques she's developed over the years, Taylor has had remarkable success. She serves police jurisdictions throughout Texas and works on cases across the country. Her job keeps her extremely busy. The unidentified woman from Yellow House Canyon was one among many nameless persons awaiting a face.
Deputy Tom Watson from the Lubbock County Sheriff's Office brought me the skull of an unidentified white female found in that area, and he asked that I try to build a face on that skull to help him identify her. And the information was provided to me that had been developed by an anthropologist to examine the skeleton. And so I knew from Tom's reports that the person I was going to be drawing was a young white female. I unfortunately didn't have a lot of other information. There was no clothing, for instance. Clothing is a very good clue as to body weight for me from skeletal remains. There was also no hair, which provides a added complication, especially in a case of a female. So because there was so little to work with, the case was a little more difficult than some of them are.
Without the victim's clothing to use as a guideline, Taylor had to take her cues from the skull alone. When putting a face on a human skull, one of the most critical parts is determining how thick the flesh will be. Taylor relies on standard tables of measurements developed by forensic anthropologists and classified by sex and race. Based on these measurements, she cuts out rubber markers that match the average depth of the skin. She glues them onto the skull at 21 anthropological landmarks, like the cheeks and chin. When the markers are in place, photographs of the skull are taken. For Taylor to accurately draw the face, the photographs must be exactly life-size and not distorted at all. After placing transparent paper over the photograph, she uses the rubber markers as guides in drawing the facial contours. It's the first step in recreating the image that may lead to the identity of the victim. Taylor also relies on scientific formulas to draw in the eyes, nose, and other features. The average human eyeball is between 24 and 25 millimeters in diameter. Since this is also the size of a U.S. quarter, Taylor has a convenient tool for tracing in each eye.
I also know from reading some ophthalmology texts that the average person has an iris diameter, an iris width really, that is between 11 and 13 millimeters. And I have little red lines on this scale showing the average range. So, and I've checked it on a number of people, and it seems to hold true for most everyone. Most everyone's iris will fall right in that range.
Taylor relies on her knowledge of anatomy to draw in the eyelids. On many people, the orbit, or eye socket, has a raised piece of bone on its outer edge. The inner edge of the socket has another bony landmark. These are the points of attachment for the ligament that stretches across the eyeball and controls the movement of the eyelid.
Our upper lids are curved slightly more than the lower lids. They tend to drop slightly over the top of the iris when looking at a person in life.
Taylor next draws the victim's nose, relying on some rules of thumb and hints provided by the skull.
Surprisingly, we do have some pretty good information about noses to help predict the look of a nose in life based on the bony clues.
Because the victim was a white female, Taylor knows to add 5 millimeters to each side of the nasal opening. That represents the width of the nose. If the victim were African American, Taylor would add 8 millimeters to each side. A bony spine at the base suggests how far the nose projects.
Because that little bit of bone tells me whether to tip the nose down or to tip it up or whether it's rather level. And so I'm looking at the profile to determine that angulation of the nasal spine, and that gives me a hint. In this case, this is quite an upturned nasal spine, so I want a tip of a nose that's up. She's a young girl. She's got a youthful little nose. And the nasal spine tells me it's turned up at the tip.
When the mouth is relaxed, the lips tend to cover the 6 front teeth. When we smile, we flash as many as 10 teeth. Taylor draws the unidentified woman's mouth in a relaxed expression to give her a neutral appearance.
So if I make a mark at the outside of those canines, that should give me an approximation of the width of the mouth. If you can see the staining of the gum line at the edge of the enamel of the teeth, gives us a ballpark idea of the vertical dimension for the lips. And again, I know that she's young, I know that she's white, so I'm thinking young white female as I draw this little mouth.
From a faceless skull, Taylor will soon create the image of a woman. She hopes it will give a name to the victim and eventually name the killer. As Karen Taylor added the finishing touches to her portrait of the unidentified woman, the victim's face was reborn. The image was now ready for prime time. Taylor's drawing was shown on television and local newspapers, giving anyone who recognized the woman the opportunity to provide information about her. For Sheriff's Deputy Tom Watson, the broadcast was a defining moment in the case.
This particular case was very frustrating for the first 6 months because we were not able to identify her. We were about to the end of all of our options as far as getting her identified until we did have the forensic drawing made. And once we aired that on the media, within a week we had 2 callers gave us the name of the dead girl.
The callers identified Taylor's drawing as Belinda K. Tillery, who'd been missing for 2 years. One of the callers was Tillery's mother, who had lost touch with her daughter. The face on the screen delivered an eerie shock of recognition. Now, with a name to go with the face, Taylor obtained a copy of Belinda Tillery's driver's license photograph. She compared it to her drawing to study the similarities that led to Tillery's identification. The resemblance was undeniable.
She has narrow or rather close-set eyes, and yet very broad face, broad cheeks. And this small nose, and the width of the nose proportionately is very close here. The mouth size is almost exactly right, and the fact that there's a very wide chin favorably compares also.
For closer identification, Taylor superimposed the photograph of Belinda Tillery onto the victim's skull.
As I was able to get the facial image on top of the skull and start to compare it, I had a couple of difficulties by this method. One being that her face is slightly turned in her driver's license photo, therefore I can't quite get the nose position correctly. However, when I put the eyes pretty much centered in the orbits, I see that she does have the facial width that my drawing shows and that I could see in this skull. So I could see that it's a pretty favorable comparison, and we probably should go ahead with finding dental records on this person if possible to make a more positive comparison.
A positive identification couldn't be made until X-rays of the victim's teeth were compared with dental records of Belinda Tillery. Dr. David Duell, a forensic dentist with the Texas Department of Public Safety, made the comparison. He found the bone structure to be the same. Teeth with fillings matched. Both X-rays showed a root canal on the same tooth, and a temporary crown was identical on each film. Dr. Duell declared it a match. Taylor's work had identified the victim. It was now up to Deputy Watson to track down the killer. He started by interviewing Belinda Tillery's friends and neighbors. Watson learned that Tillery had had an abusive boyfriend named Troy Armstrong. It was rumored that he'd become angry when she told him she was pregnant with someone else's child. Watson obtained a photograph of Armstrong and went looking for him. He tracked him to Roswell, New Mexico. There, he searched the town. He questioned the locals, digging for any lead he could find. But Armstrong was gone. He'd found out that he was a suspect in Belinda's murder. Back in Lubbock, as Watson gathered more information, a picture of Belinda's last days became clearer. It had been 2 years since anyone had seen her. That's when some folks heard she'd gone camping with Armstrong. He liked to camp in Yellow House Canyon. It was a remote place that he knew well.
What's going on front, all right? I'll catch up with you, okay?
All right, well, come on.
People mentioned that he carried a large hunting knife almost everywhere he went. The pieces were fitting together. It seemed that a bitter Armstrong had planned to take Belinda to this remote canyon and get rid of her for good. He thought no one would find her remains. After Belinda's death, he told a girlfriend he had nightmares about stabbing someone in the back. Based on the evidence, Watson obtained a warrant for Troy Armstrong's arrest, but he still had no information on his whereabouts. More than a year later, in January 1996, Watson received a tip. He found out that Armstrong was on the road with a truck driver buddy who was hauling for a company in California. Watson quickly contacted the trucking company. He discovered that their trucks were equipped with a global positioning system called GPS. A transponder on each truck bounced a signal off a satellite, telling the company where it was at all times. They informed him that the truck he was looking for was now traveling through Nebraska. Within minutes, Watson got the Nebraska State Police on the other line and asked them to set up a roadblock. They dispatched several cars to intercept the truck. As the police waited, they maintained contact with Watson and the trucking company, keeping tabs on the truck's whereabouts at all times. They knew just when to expect it. When the truck came barreling down the highway, the driver saw the roadblock ahead. He tried to escape, but the police sprang into action. Once the truck was halted, the police moved in. Hiding inside was Troy Armstrong. He was arrested for the murder of Belinda Tillery. By now, evidence against him had mounted. A former girlfriend and others admitted that he had confessed to killing Tillery. On December 5th, 1996, Armstrong was convicted for murder and sentenced to life in prison. Karen Taylor's lifelike reconstruction of Belinda K. Tillery was the key to solving a difficult case. Without it, the victim would never have been identified, and the killer never brought to justice. Like the artist she was trained to be, Taylor relies on pen and paper to capture likenesses. Elsewhere, scientists are beginning to apply digital technology to achieve a similar goal. At Colorado State University in Fort Collins, they're developing equipment to match faces to skulls with laser beam accuracy. Mechanical engineering professor Patrick Fitzhorn and a graduate student combined computer-aided design with laser technology. They created a system that scans three-dimensional objects and reconstructs them in a computer.
So what this machine can do is build a three-dimensional surface mesh, computer surface mesh, of a human skull that we can then play with on the computer. We can scale it up and down, we can move it through space.
As the skull rotates slowly on the platter, a laser beam strikes it at 10,000 to 50,000 points. A sensor measures the distance the beam travels as it reflects off each point. The results are fed into a computer that creates a digital version of the skull. The image is virtual, but its application is real.
And obviously what we want to do with it then at that point is to fix it in space, to take a scanned facial photograph and to map the photograph on the skull to see whether there's a match or not.
A photograph of the would-be owner of the skull is also scanned. The digital photo can be cleaned up and sharpened. Here, Fitzhorn made the photograph semi-transparent so he could superimpose it over the skull. Now he can compare their features.
But here you can see the teeth in here. There's the bridge of the nose. Here are the eyes. There's the eyeball in its orb. There's the other eyeball in its orb. There's the end of the cheekbone here. The jaw line down in here.
Currently, a forensic artist relies on his best guess to determine whether a photograph matches a skull. He takes measurements and superimposes a photograph over a skull. But if the picture was taken from an odd angle, it could distort the results.
The mouth doesn't match up. And now what we're seeing is how the skull is oriented. You can see how it's rotated in here with respect to the photograph. So here, this is the plane that the photograph is in, and you can see the skewing of the skull with respect to it. Again, trying to line the skull up in orientation with respect to the way the face was oriented when the camera photograph was taken.
Fitzhorn can rotate the skull and reorient the scanned facial photograph to minimize the distortion. Some photos aren't clear enough or are too distorted to enhance, defying efforts to make a match that's 100% certain. But Fitzhorn is convinced that his method is much more precise, less subjective than previous methods.
But one of the things that I'm really excited about is the potential to take 4 or 5 points on the skull, to take 4 or 5 matching points on the face, and actually attempt to compute whether or not there's a match. What we'd like to be able to do is numerically compute this fit on the computer, and then be able to say something like, this is a 95% probability of match, or this is a 35% probability of match.
As Patrick Fitzhorn and his colleagues perfect their computer face matching system, forensic artists in Louisiana are on a different mission. Instead of applying digital technology to identify the dead, they're hoping to use it to find the living. In this case, a girl who's been missing for over 20 years. In 1976, in a small town in Louisiana, a family argument turned sour. It wasn't the first time Geneva Martin and her teenage daughter argued. But what started out as a typical mother-daughter conflict soon turned into a 21-year ordeal for Geneva Martin.
She was 16 years old, you know. She let her opinion be known, and I let my opinion be known, and she wasn't any more wrong than I was.
The argument ended as many before. The two went back to their chores without saying a word to each other. Then Donna decided to leave.
Bye, Mom.
She said she was going to her grandmother's house. It was 2:30 p.m. By 5, she hadn't returned, so her concerned mother went looking for her at her grandmother's. But Donna wasn't there. Her grandmother said Donna had gone next door to play cards with her Aunt Peggy.
Well, didn't think anything about it, went back home. When she wasn't home at 9 o'clock, we went to Peggy's and there was no Donna.
Donna Martin had run away from home before, but this time it seemed like she wasn't coming back. Despite many attempts to find her, almost a year passed before Geneva Martin heard any news of her daughter. Then, one of Donna's friends told Geneva she had picked up Donna on the road and given her a ride to an apartment she was sharing in Baton Rouge. Geneva, desperately wanting to patch things up with her daughter, went to find her. But when she got there, the apartment was vacant. All that remained was Donna's name on the mailbox. The manager confirmed that Donna had been living there.
Excuse me, are you Mrs. Clark?
I took a picture of Donna to her, and she told me, yes, this was the young girl that had lived in the apartment with another married couple. From there, we found nothing.
Despite all she did to find her daughter, the trail remained cold for more than 20 years. Today, Geneva Martin hopes researchers at Louisiana State University will help heat it up again. Forensic anthropologist Mary Manheim and forensic artist Eileen Barrow use computers to simulate the aging process. If they can produce an accurate likeness of Donna Martin today at age 37, her mother may have a chance of finding her. LSU's Forensic Anthropology and Computer Enhancement Services, or FACES, is an ambitious program that's collecting data on the subtleties of the human face. Among its objectives, to develop precise standards of measurement for tissue thickness on the human skull. The information is used by forensic artists trying to build faces from bare bones. Until now, they relied on measurements based on cadavers. Manheim believes that using live subjects will produce much more accurate measurements. By using living models, Manheim can select from a much broader and more complete statistical range. Though subjects remain anonymous, their age, sex, race, height, weight, and other personal information becomes part of the computer's database. To measure tissue thickness, she uses an ultrasound scanner, like the ones used to show a fetus in the womb. The scanner bounces sound waves off the skull. By measuring the time it takes for waves to return, a computer calculates the exact depth of the tissue from skin to bone. The process is repeated at 19 points across the skull.
We've scanned over 400 and almost 500 people now, and those range in age from 2 years of age to approximately 74 years of age. There are many different sizes, many different racial groups, so we will separate these out, height, weight, age, etc., and we will produce standards.
Mannheim has scanned the faces of generations of the same family. The data will show how family resemblances change over time. Mannheim and her colleagues are also using computers to show what a missing child's face might look like as it grows older. With young children, the first step is stretching the child's features to reflect growth of the skull. In this case, a 5-year-old child disappeared and has been missing 5 years. Barrow renders the child at age 10. The computer stretching tool divides the face into a grid.
And you pull each intersection of that grid down just a few steps. All right, so then that's the stretch. When we age a child, of course, the first thing we need is a picture of the child and a picture of her father and mother, or a sibling, or whoever the parent or the sibling might be that she looks most like.
The face can now be merged with the faces of her immediate family to create a composite image. With the click of a mouse, Barrow brings the missing child's features to the front.
To retain her particular look, the eyes and eyebrows, we would bring back a little bit of the shape of her nose and a little bit of the shape of her mouth. And then we would bring back or bring to the foreground her father's teeth, since she is, in this particular picture, the child had been missing for 5 years. So we were progressing her from 5 years old to about 10. So by that time, her teeth would have, of course, baby teeth would be gone and she would have permanent teeth. So we used the father's teeth to put in the picture.
The computer makes the manipulations easily, but Barrow must rely on her own judgment to decide which features to alter. Will the child look like a parent or more like her sibling? It's a question she'll need to answer when aging Donna Martin. Creating an image of what she might look like today will pose an extraordinary challenge. She'll have to be aged 21 years. Donna's face won't be stretched because at age 16 her face was fully developed.
All right.
Barrow will concentrate on other techniques. First, photographs of family members close to the age Donna would be today are scanned into the computer. Because family members tend to age alike, this will help guide Barrow as she makes decisions about aging Donna. By studying the photographs, Barrow can begin to see at what stage the relatives begin to show crow's feet or lines around the mouth, and how severe they might be. She can also see when chins begin to droop or when necks begin to sag.
She really did not look very much at all like her sisters, which I expected that she would. And she really didn't have a lot of resemblance to her mother. So we had no pictures of her father at that age, so I decided that the best thing to do would be to try to merge her with her mother.
To merge the image of Donna Martin at 16 with her mother at age 40, Barrow must first align and resize the photographs. The photograph of Donna is a 3/4 view. To align it with her mother's, Barrow must adjust it to show a frontal view.
Now what happens here is that the mother's picture is quite a bit bigger than hers. So then what I have to do is size the picture of the mother. And that means reducing its size to try to fit the other one.
Barrow patiently and meticulously merges the photographs. She makes sure Donna's features remain dominant while taking some physical cues from her mother's image. Then she erases Donna's hairstyle at age 16 so a more mature style can be added. Finally, the transformation is complete. The 16-year-old Donna Martin has become a woman of 37.
Well, it looks a lot like our family. Oddly enough, it looks like my husband's family rather than myself.
Geneva Martin will distribute the image of Donna nationwide. She hopes it will finally reunite her with her daughter and put to rest that fateful argument that's gone unresolved for 21 years. The work of one forensic artist may lead a daughter back to her mother. In one of forensic art's most acclaimed cases, another artist used his skills to lead police to a killer. In 1971, the quiet surface of a prosperous community was shattered by a brutal crime. A successful accountant, John Emil List, lived with his family in a mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. Then his fortunes waned. So in November of 1971, List began a new life. But first, he had to end his current one. He killed his entire family, his wife, 3 children, and his elderly mother. Then he dragged the bodies into the ballroom and arranged them neatly in a row. He tried to clean as much of their blood off the floor as he could. He also sat down to write a long letter of confession. When he finished, he left his house for the last time. A month passed before the Westfield police received a call from a woman concerned about her neighbors. She hadn't seen them home, and their lights had been on day and night until one by one they'd burned out.
I'm back either. I think we're going to have to make entry.
When the police arrived, they found an unattended mansion in need of repair. They looked around the outside of the house until they found an open window. When they entered, they had no idea what was waiting for them. The air was cold and filled with the odor of decay. They kept searching through the darkness until they finally came upon the List family in the ballroom, still neatly laid out, dead for a month. It was one of the most grotesque murders Westfield police had ever seen. When detectives were called in, they found the guns List had used and his letter of confession. List was an active member in the church and addressed the letter to his pastor. In it, he explained that he was no longer able to support his family and pay for the mansion his wife had insisted they buy. He was worried his family faced a life of humiliation on welfare. He was also upset his wife and children had stopped attending church. He felt his daughter had taken a misguided interest in acting, which threatened to deny her status as one of God's children. At least, he concluded, I'm certain they've all gone to heaven now. After slaying his family, List left his car at New York's Kennedy Airport and took a bus heading out of town. He hid his crime carefully. A month passed before anyone noticed his disappearance. Police and the FBI conducted a worldwide search, but nothing turned up. 18 years later, New Jersey detective Bernard Tracy was still on the case. He would make one last effort to find John Emil List by turning to the experts who combine art and science to age the human face. An accurate portrait of John List as a middle-aged man might alert someone somewhere to turn him in.
One thing I can tell you about the John List investigation, back in 1971, this was a state-of-the-art investigation.
Tracy was assigned to the case in 1974, taking over from detectives who'd been on the case for 3 years. The investigation was one of the most thorough ever conducted by New Jersey police. In their search for clues, detectives performed psychological profiles of List and his family.
We did little profiles on the victims. That was John List, his oldest son. His son Frederick, who was 13 at the time. And his daughter Patricia was 16.
Though the case had cooled by 1974, Tracy was convinced John List was still alive.
The common case is that when a person kills people close to them, they kill themselves shortly thereafter. If he wasn't found shortly thereafter dead, a victim of suicide, then I believed he would still be alive. It was just a question of where.
In an effort to find out, Tracy persuaded a television producer to include the case in a series on fugitives from justice. The producer, in turn, enlisted the expertise of Philadelphia forensic artist Frank Bender to sculpt the face of List as he might appear at age 63. The sculpture would appear on television for millions of people to see. If Bender could produce a good likeness of John List 18 years after the crime, he might finally be found. To help guide his imagination as he adds years to a face, Bender carefully reviews the subject's background and his habits, knowing they're unlikely to change. Behavior can influence how a person ages. Before starting the List project, Bender thoroughly researched his subject. He discussed List's psychological aspects with forensic psychologists and police experts.
Relax. If you mow your lawn in a suit and tie, you're not relaxed. It's about staying in control. He'll still be wearing probably the same clothes, the same type of bow tie. None of that's going to change.
You know, I've been going to a church on Sundays, and as often as I can, to try to get the feel of like what his environment is really like.
Any clue police gave him about List's life helped Bender form an image of how he may have aged.
Lifestyle, hairstyle, hobbies, hereditary factors. Then I either do my own psychological profile, as I've done in numerous cases, or as in this case, bring in a forensic psychologist and go back and forth with this individual, walk around the town for maybe 2 or 3 days, really get to know this person, put my feet in their shoes, and in a sense kind of become the person so I can stay one step ahead of them visually.
To obtain a scientific outlook on the aging process, Bender visited the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania. Here he consulted with Dr. Scott Bartlett, an expert in cranial and facial surgery and in repairing congenital deformities of the face. Dr. Bartlett's knowledge of the aging process, as reflected in the human face, made him a valuable ally. Bender was curious about the appearance of a scar behind List's ear from an operation.
The scar went from his ear down to at least his collar.
I would guess that, you know, drawing the ear in something like this, more to the side of the head, and I would guess that there's bound to be, if he had an open mastoid operation, that he might have a fairly significant scar back here.
Dr. Bartlett pointed out that as List aged, wrinkles and folds in his neck could make the scar less noticeable.
I see, okay.
The two men also discussed how aging affects the eyelids and brows, which can change significantly over 18 years.
The canthal attachment here, which is the outer and the inner corners of the eye, I don't think change a lot. I think what we're seeing here is this hooding, this laxity of the soft tissue that's now falling over and giving this a downward slant, down and outward slant to the eye opening here, as opposed to this fresh up and out slant that you see in youth.
Ultimately, Frank Bender would apply his own intuition to what he learned about the case. Bender has been a sculptor for more than 30 years, showing his work in galleries and museums all over the United States.
Most of my studies are human behavior. I'm a people person. When I go to the beach, I don't look at the ocean as much as I like studying the people on the beach, how they interact, what they look like, the differences, what makes each person an individual.
Beginning his sculpture of John List, Bender had a problem. He had to construct a three-dimensional model, yet the only available photograph of List was a frontal view. There were no pictures showing a three-quarter or side view. Bender would rely on his experience as a commercial photographer to study the photograph and analyze its three dimensions based on highlight and shadow.
Now, with fugitives, you have old photographs. The most important thing with a fugitive, I found, is to stay within the perimeters of the skull. The same as facial reconstruction. This is where the similarities lie. If you elongate the head, you theoretically are changing the shape of the skull, the foundation underneath.
As he worked on his sculpture, he checked his work with acetate overlays made from the 20-year-old photograph.
I take an old photograph, enlarge it to what I feel would be life size, do acetate overlays, and then lie it over the sculpture as I'm working on it to make sure that I'm within the perimeters of the skull.
As a face began to emerge from clay, Bender delved ever deeper into the mind of John List.
I felt that John List wanted to kind of be, in a sense, a generic individual. You know, wanted to blend in, didn't want to create waves. Wanted some peace in his life, which he never got from his wife. And this started building up his anxiety. I really believe he tried to get this through the church and was getting it. But when he came back home, it was complete overload.
Once the preliminary sculpture was complete, Bender and his assistant made a plaster cast.
That's good.
Little by little, Bender's sculpture took shape. By now, Bender was more familiar with List's face than with his own. As the bust of the fugitive emerged from its mold, Frank Bender was ready to add the final details to the face of a killer. John Emil List, after murdering his family, had evaded capture for 18 years. Whether police could find him would depend on Frank Bender's intuitive ability to imagine John List in his early 60s. Bender guessed that List's hairline continued to recede, as it had begun to do in his earlier photograph. He added jowls based on his assessment of List's lifestyle.
He wasn't an exercise type person. He was a potato and meat type person. As far as the eyes, you know, you can see where he's starting to get some lines. Look a little tired. You see, he has, I sculpted the tie and the shirt and the coat, you know, the suit coat on him, because he's always going to be wearing that.
Bender sensed that the years of hiding what he had done would take a toll on List. This influenced his decision to turn the corners of his mouth down.
You can see the corners of the mouth going down here rather than up like the photograph, which I'll bring right over. And you can see how they turned up. After 20 years, I'm having them go down. Not his whole mouth going down, just the corners. Again, not only aging, but the fear of getting caught.
As a final touch, Bender selected eyeglasses for the aged List. He searched for a style that would define a man who killed his entire family, yet called himself a Christian. He decided on thick black frames, thinking List might go for an austere, authoritative look that would discourage others from prying into his past. Now his sculpture was ready for the nation to see. On May 21st, 1989, millions of people across the United States saw Frank Bender's sculpture of John Emile List. Was the likeness good enough to catch the killer?
Oh my God, that's Bob Clark.
Ricky!
Yeah? Is that Mr. Clark? Yeah, it looks like
One of the viewers was a woman from Denver, Colorado. When she saw the bust, she called in. She said it looked just like her former neighbor, Robert P. Clark, who moved to Virginia.
Good morning. We're with the FBI. Yes, can you direct us to the office of Robert Clark, please?
Yes, Mr. Clark's office is down.
Following up on the tip, FBI agents found a man who called himself Robert Clark at an office in Richmond, Virginia. After years of getting away with a horrible murder, List was about to see his last days as a free man. When the agents approached him, he insisted he was not John List. But on his neck was the telltale scar, and his fingerprints matched those of the killer. With that, the agents had proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Robert P. Clark and John Emile List were in fact the same man. Since the murders, John List had remarried and recreated his life as an accountant, confident that the crimes he'd committed in 1971 would never come back to haunt him. For Detective Bernard Tracy, it was the end of an incredible odyssey. A cold-blooded murderer finally captured after 18 years. By all accounts, the resemblance between the bust created by Frank Bender and the actual John List was uncanny.
I think the bust was something that if a person looked at that and had any doubt that that would be the straw that broke the camel's back, that would be the one. If they had any hesitation about calling and then they saw the bust, that would be the one that would take them over the edge and say, I got a call, this is him.
John Emile List was convicted of murdering his family and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. He and his unsuspecting new wife were attending a church function on the night Frank Bender's sculpture aired nationwide. As a result, they missed the show that gave John List yet another new start in life, in New Jersey's state penitentiary. Armed with photographs, scientific data, psychological profiles, and artistic talent, forensic artists breathe new life into unsolved cases. Using their unique knowledge of human physiology and human nature, they can help locate the missing, track murderers through time, and bring killers to justice. A man retrieves the burned remains of someone who may be his brother. But how can he really be sure? Under the rubble of a burned-down house, investigators find the shattered remnants of a body. Can they piece together what happened? A scientist must identify a woman from scraps of burned bones weighing less than 3 paper clips. Will he be up to the challenge? The fate of a murder investigation hangs in the balance. For centuries, killers have relied on fire to conceal their crimes. But today, science is catching up with them. The consuming flames are powerless to destroy the burning evidence. Fire. Medieval alchemists saw it as a tool of transformation. Used correctly, it could turn dull lead into gleaming gold. Fire does transform, but not in the way the alchemists hoped. It is a process called oxidation, the speedy marriage of convenience between oxygen and another substance. The union creates new compounds, like carbon and water, while releasing enormous amounts of energy in the form of heat and light. All fires need an initiator, a spark to get them going. It's a little boost of energy that sets off the chain reaction. Then the fire burns until there's nothing left to burn. In Ohio, in 1994, Danny King started a fire, initiating a chain of events that transformed his entire world. King had a fiery relationship with his live-in girlfriend, Marilyn Garland. They had been together on and off for years and had a 3-year-old child. But one March night, things spun horribly out of control. Danny King shot and killed Marilyn Garland. Then he tried to hide every trace of his crime. He set the body afire and kept it burning in a metal drum for 2 days. Occasionally, he'd stir the brittle bones with a stick, burning them until they would burn no more. He took what was left and smashed it into little pieces with a hammer. He gathered the remains and dumped them in the river. He may have thought that without a body, there could be no proof of murder. Then he ditched the drum behind a warehouse in town, a place where similar drums stood. Certain he had gotten away with his crime, Danny King waited 6 days before he called the police to report Garland as a missing person. Lieutenant Ray Todd worked on the case.
Danny King reported Marilyn missing on the 26th, and said that she'd been gone for a week. Well, it wasn't unusual for Marilyn to just take off for a few days at a time and go party.
In his office, Lieutenant Todd reviewed King's missing persons report. Despite Garland's reputation, he had to take it seriously. He was joined on the case by Detective Gregory Macco. Macco found that Garland's family was taking the disappearance very seriously.
We talked to other family members, getting conflicting stories, some saying this is not her. This was her years ago when she was wild and free, but now she had a little boy. She wouldn't do this. She wouldn't leave the little boy behind. Something's wrong. They didn't believe that she just up and packed up and left. They actually believed that something had happened to her.
Detective Macco began investigating more thoroughly. It was standard procedure to interview the person who filed the report, so they called in Danny King for questioning.
He's a boyfriend, he's going to be a suspect, and our thinking was, let's eliminate him immediately.
That wasn't how it worked out. The interview took an unexpected turn.
After that interview process, we asked him if he would be willing to take a polygraph, a lie detector test. And he kind of hedged on it at first. So it just threw red flags.
They arranged the test for the next day and dismissed King. King should have gone home, but he didn't. He went to a bar, concerned about the polygraph, and began drinking. He met a drinking buddy there and confided that he was worried about the test. The more he drank, the more he talked. Soon he confessed to killing Garland. His friend could tell King was serious. He felt he had no choice but to go to the police.
He proceeded to tell me that he just left the bar where him and Danny King were drinking for a couple of hours. and that Danny King had confessed to him.
Now the police had 3 facts to go on: a missing woman, a second-hand barroom confession, and a suspect who was nervous about a polygraph test. In terms of evidence, it was shaky at best. But Detective Macko and Lieutenant Todd felt it was enough to arrest King on suspicion of murder. King lived with a small child and a large dog, so the police felt uneasy about arresting him at his house. They decided to wait it out and apprehend him the next morning. They had no idea how violent he might be, but if he did commit this crime, they knew they were dealing with a dangerous man. Police called in the SWAT team for backup.
Hey, he's coming down.
There he is. As King went off to work, they forced his truck into a roadblock and made their move.
Put your hands up! Put them up! Get out of the van. You're under arrest, right? Put your hands up.
After King was safely in custody, the police began to build their case. For that, they needed more evidence. They obtained a search warrant and inspected King's house, but they found nothing incriminating. They had divers search the river and the canal for remains. They came up dry. Without a body, a weapon, or any other evidence against him, Lieutenant Todd didn't have a case, and Danny King would go free. If King truly did try to destroy the evidence in a metal drum, they reasoned, the drum must be around somewhere. But all they had was a burned patch of grass. The police placed an ad in the paper to find the drum.
Howdy, Bob?
Soon after the ad ran, police received a call from a local businessman. One of his employees noticed a suspicious-looking barrel behind their warehouse. Lieutenant Todd went out to inspect it.
You could see some debris inside the bottom. Reached in and picked up what I believed to be was a bone fragment. When I saw that, I just knew that this was the barrel that was used to burn the body of Marilyn Garland.
Todd shook the drum to remove more debris clinging to its interior. Out came nails, scraps of wire, some fabric, and a seed pod.
There's one seed in this vial here, and this was found in the barrel, okay? And we didn't know where it may have come from. Later, we had it identified as a catalpa seed. It's kind of an unusual tree, and there's not that many in the area. And there is a catalpa tree at 125 Canal Street, which is where the murder took place and where Danny burned Marilyn's body in the barrel.
But potentially, the most damning evidence pulled from the drum was also the smallest, tiny shards of bone. If Todd could prove they were the victims, he'd have a case. He sent them to the coroner for analysis. The coroner was fairly sure the bones were human.
However, he wanted them looked at by a top forensic anthropologist.
Okay,
He contacted Doug Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Owsley has built an international reputation by identifying human remains. This wasn't the first time Owsley had worked with the Summit County Coroner's Office. A few years earlier, he helped them analyze the remains of Jeffrey Dahmer's first victim.
We've had cases where they involve dismemberment, where they will dismember parts of the body and they'll put them in different locations. We've had cases where they've used acids and corrosives and disfigurement of the body to try and make it difficult to say who that person is. They all tell you something about the individual behind that process, and in the same sense, they all leave different kinds of evidence.
In the case of Marilyn Garland, Owsley was literally scraping the bottom of the barrel. The evidence he had to work with consisted of 2.9 grams of bone fragments, about the weight of 3 paper clips. He also had 3 tiny shards of tooth enamel. All had been on fire for 2 days and were shrunken and distorted by the process. Could Owsley make sense of the paltry slivers?
So it looks like. Okay, and that's dark too, but that
Forensic
shows the whole
scientist
thing.
Doug Owsley faced many challenges in his work on the Marilyn Garland murder. The first was confirming whether the bone fragments from the metal drum were human.
In this instance, we got really lucky because one of the fragments that was preserved was his finger bone. And if you think about it, different animals out there have very distinctive foot and hand bone structure. Think of a hoof, for instance, or what the foot of a dog looks like. It's very different than what we see in the human. And we've got not a complete bone, but actually just half of it, but it's enough of the bone for us to actually be able to look at that and say, well, that's human morphology. Here, for instance,
Owsley's next task was more daunting. Could he tell if these were the remains of Marilyn Garland?
With burning, it takes maybe more time to analyze it, and you really have to know exactly what you're looking for. But you still, with the fragments of the bone, male skeletons tend to be bigger, females tend to, on average, to be smaller. And so how it is burned and the size that is the result of that process is still going to tell you often something about sex. Will still tell you something about age. And so it may make the identification much more difficult, more time-consuming, maybe more tedious, but there's going to be a lot of evidence there.
At the outset of the identification process, Owsley knew nothing about the victim's physical features. That's the way he prefers to work on a case.
The ideal circumstance often is not to know a great deal about it. It's better to be a little bit in the dark on that sort of thing, or a lot in the dark about that. Let the bones talk to you in terms of what they have to say what the evidence is from those.
From the remains, Owsley identified 2 rib fragments. The largest was a ½ inch long. He could tell one came from near the breastbone, perhaps the 4th or 5th rib. It provided the key to unlocking secrets about the body it came from. As we age, the rounded ends of our bones become more cup-shaped. The rib's cupped end suggested the person was between 24 and 40 years old. It was 3.4 millimeters thick by 13 millimeters wide. Owsley considered that small, even after assuming it shrunk up to 25% in the fire.
You can never, on a piece of bone that size, bet everything. But on the other hand, you can turn around and say, in terms of probability, in terms of comparative data that we have, it's likely that this is a very small person.
The size suggested the victim was either a female or a small male. To determine which, he compared the bone's height and thickness against a standard chart of rib measurements.
In females, the 5th rib is going to have an average width of 4.65 millimeters. Males, 5th rib is going to be 6.78, so it's much larger in terms of its thickness. So you work it through as best you can and try and characterize for the entire rib cage male and female values and what the difference is.
With this bone, the answer was clear. By all standards, the person it came from was petite, very likely a female. The bones had told him all they could. It was time to take a look at the tooth fragments. Owsley had only 3 to work with. They were little more than chips of enamel. By examining the thickness of the enamel, Owsley could tell they were from adult teeth. Their shape suggested their approximate position in the victim's mouth. They had telltale grooves that suggested dental work. But it wasn't enough. He needed some high-tech help to expose traces of fillings. Then he could match them to Garland's dental records. Owsley sent the teeth to the Smithsonian's Conservation Analytical Laboratory. There, they underwent a process called energy dispersive spectroscopy, or EDS. Most dental fillings are a combination of silver, tin, mercury, and copper. They melt in the heat of a fire, leaving behind invisible traces. The EDS brings them out. The tooth fragment is put into the chamber. Then the air is drawn out, creating a vacuum. An electron beam bombards the sample. It can be aimed very precisely. The EDS provides a 3D image so the operator knows where to point the beam. The stream of energy excites electrons in the sample, causing some of them to fly off. Some elements give off more electrons, some produce fewer. By measuring the electrons spewing from the sample, the EDS determines what elements it's made from. The results come out as a graph of peaks and valleys. Each peak represents a different element. Its height corresponds to the amount of the element in the sample. The graph was printed out and given to Owsley to analyze.
This is an area here on this count, fragment 1, where we're scanning on the tooth surface. You can pick up the peak for calcium, peak for phosphorus, and those are normal tooth enamel. On that same fragment, if you go to a different location, here now we're starting to get a peak for tin, indicating the presence of tin on that tooth surface.
The EDS showed that 2 of the fragments had traces of copper, and all 3 had traces of tin. Because the metals were found only on specific parts of the teeth, Owsley concluded that they were the remains of fillings, not contamination from the metal drum. He had already determined from their shape that he had fragments of premolars. Now he knew they all had fillings. With this information, he was ready to compare his findings against Marilyn Garland's dental records.
So working with a dentist, I sat down, we went through and figured out which teeth she'd lost in life, which teeth had fillings, what types of fillings they were, and we would prepare a dental chart. And this is a basis for comparison with the dental fragments that we had.
Most of Marilyn Garland's premolars had fillings. So the fact that all of the fragments also had fillings was consistent with her dental records.
So I could never really say that it was absolutely this tooth or that tooth, but I could say that she in life had those teeth. And of those, 7 of those 8 teeth had fillings, and I've got 3 fragments of those teeth, and all of them have fillings. So it's a consistency there. It's a point that seems to support this association. So it's just one bit of evidence.
Those bits of evidence added up to create a portrait of a victim that was alarmingly similar to Marilyn Garland. Marilyn Garland, age 35, stood 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 115 pounds.
Obviously, they couldn't positively say that it was her, but he was able to say that it was a petite female, possibly white female, between the ages of 25 and 35. I mean, it really narrowed it down, which was, surprising to me, just to find some remains, charred remains, to be able to look at him and obtain that much information from him. That was surprising.
Awaiting trial, Danny King learned that he'd left enough evidence for scientists to come so close to identifying Marilyn Garland. Rattled by the news, he made one more mistake.
Danny King confessed a second time, this time to an inmate at Summit County Jail, and the inmate ended up telling us about it. And Danny King even told him where he had disposed of the gun.
King admitted stashing the gun in a storm sewer behind a restaurant. Detective Todd drove to the location and found it immediately. Police had all they needed: the confessions, the burned barrel, the weapon, and Doug Owsley, who turned a handful of splintered bones into rock-solid evidence.
I've been involved in a number of cases where you're searching for a missing person. You know that person in your heart, you know that person's dead. And they may even have good, strong evidence as to who's behind this. But without that body being recovered and without that physical evidence, you still could go to trial, but it gets much more difficult. It gets, you need a lot of good physical evidence, and a skeleton or a body is going to be a critical thing.
Danny King was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 21 years to life. Generations of murderers have relied on fire to hide their crimes. But some little detail always lingers for those who know what to look for. In Tennessee, investigators depended on scorched bones to divine not only a dead man's identity, but also the strange circumstances of his death. On January 15, 1981, a house burned to the ground in Kingsport, Tennessee, before the fire department could save it. The owner, James Grizzle, hadn't been seen since the blaze. Nobody gave it a second thought, because Grizzle spent much of his time in Virginia. Then, Detective James Moffett of the Kingsport Police received a call from Grizzle's mother in Virginia.
What's his name?
She was concerned because she hadn't heard from her son in several days.
Where does he live at?
Moffett smelled trouble. He knew that Grizzle had hired a live-in handyman named Stephen Leon Williams to help renovate the house. Williams was not a model citizen.
I knew Stephen Leon Williams, and I was investigating him on some burglaries. And I knew that Mr. Williams was living with Mr. Grizzle in Hawkins County. I talked to Mr. Grizzle probably about a week before his house burned about Leon.
The fire department didn't look for a body once the blaze was out. But after hearing from Grizzle's mother, Moffett began to suspect something more than a house fire. If Grizzle was in the house when it burned, his remains would still be there. Moffett would need an expert to determine if Grizzle's death was an accident or murder. He called state forensic anthropologist William Bass.
It's an interesting case because most houses that have burned down, the fire department's been there, lots of people have walked through the area. This was one of the few cases in which nobody had walked into this house at all. So you got there and the house had burned down and there were no footprints in the house at all. And so we were the first ones in there.
See over here.
The undisturbed condition of the site assured Bass that any signs of foul play would still be there.
Mr. Grizzle may be in there.
Moffett pointed out the locations of the bedrooms, kitchen, and living room so Bass could get his bearings. As with any archaeological excavation, he and his team carefully sifted through the debris with trowels and brushes. They moved one brick at a time, searching for the all-important remains. A little over an hour after they began, Bass found some human lower leg bones on the concrete basement floor. Before long, scattered bones started coming out of the rubble, and with them, a horrible story began to emerge.
The body had been lying on its back, but the legs were up over the body, as if you lay down and take your feet and pull them up to your head. However, there was no head.
The victim was separated below the shoulders, and the upper and lower halves of the skeleton were 12 feet apart. That wasn't entirely unusual. A skeleton may become jumbled if the victim had fallen through the floor and landed in the basement. But Bass knew that wasn't the case here. Had the body fallen, he would have found debris between the skeleton and the concrete. Bass found no debris. In fact, the victim was fused to the floor.
It's like taking a piece of meat and putting it in a hot skillet. That meat will sear onto the hot surface. In this case, the fats running out were so hot that they literally solidified what clothing remained. So we had to scrape off the clothing, and there was no debris between the floor and the bones.
The condition of the clothing told Bass the victim was in the basement when the fire began. If the body didn't fall from a height, Bass knew of only one other way to explain how the bones became scattered: an explosion. Neighbors' reports confirmed Bass's conclusion. They heard a blast shortly before the fire. Judging from the way the upper torso was separated, Bass suspected the center of the explosion was on the victim's chest. It might have been some freak accident. But then Bass found another clue. The flattened remains of a spent bullet lay upon the basement floor, just below the victim's heart. Bass could tell from its mushroom shape that it had traveled through the victim and flattened against the concrete. At first glance, it looked like homicide. But homicide cases are won on hard facts, not speculation. To prove murder, he needed all the evidence he could muster. In his lab at the University of Tennessee, Bass has teased the truth from countless human remains. Here, he took a closer look at the bones pulled from Grizzle's house. He would try to determine what events caused the destruction of a home and the death of a person. With burned remains, it's not always easy. When a body burns, much of it is destroyed. The arms and legs separate. Fluid in the head turns to steam and bursts the skull. As bones burn, they retain their shape, but they shrink up to 33%, depending on the temperature of the fire, how long they were exposed to it, and which bones they are. Fire turns them brittle. They shatter while they burn and can crumble if they're touched or moved afterward. Collecting a complete skeleton is nearly impossible. Because burning disfigures bones, it's a common way to hide the cause of death. Investigators must learn to distinguish the subtle differences between damage caused by fire and damage from a murder weapon. Bass demonstrates that even a bullet in the head can go undetected unless the forensic investigator knows how to find it.
All of these pieces were all together in a jumble. We x-rayed this, and there is little flakes of lead in the bone, indicating, hey, this individual's been shot. Then we wanted, can we determine where this individual was shot? So we sat down and started putting the skull together, all of these pieces, and sure enough, here comes your entry wound right there.
Joanne Bennett, a student of Dr. Bass, is hoping to find a more efficient way to recognize injuries not caused by fire. In her research, she experiments with bone scraps from pigs. First, she damages them to simulate foul play, then burns them to see how they change.
We designed several different traumatic events to address the trauma that anthropologists recognize.
Bennett and other graduate students saw, strike, and stab a variety of pig bones. The bones are then photographed, x-rayed, and sketched to record every nuance of the damage. Once the bones have been cataloged, the students burn them. If they're lucky, they use a house scheduled to be torched for fire training. The goal is to simulate as closely as possible a real-world situation. After the smoke clears, the students pick through the rubble to retrieve as many bone fragments as they can find.
Oh, I found one.
They take the bones back to the lab and examine them to see if they can detect the marks they made. The marks made by a scalpel or saw blade survived the fire with no problem. The fine striations of the saw can even be seen with the naked eye. The marks made by the hammer are less easy to discern. Bennett is just starting her research. As she and her colleagues experiment with a wider sample of bones, she feels confident they'll come up with some guidelines forensic investigators can use in the future. With the remains in his lab, Bass pieced together the sorry events that transpired in James Grizzle's house. The flattened bullet and scattered bones suggested murder. The color of the bones backed that up. As bones heat up, their color changes. Forensic investigators depend on that to estimate the fire's temperature. Especially hot flames suggest an accelerant like gasoline was used. And that means arson. At about 545 degrees Fahrenheit, bones turn reddish or grayish brown. Between 970 and 1200 degrees, they turn black. Over 1200 degrees, all the organic material burns out, leaving a white shell of calcium. The remains in Grizzle's house were white. they must have burned at about 2,000 degrees, indicating the use of an accelerant. Bass concluded the fire was deliberately set. Now, Bass was sure he could prove homicide. The burned remains told him that the victim was shot to death, the body blown apart, and the house set on fire to hide the crime. But who was the victim? Though reasonably certain it was James Grizzle, Bass had to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Without naming the victim, Moffat couldn't catch his murderer. To identify the victim, Bass first examined seams in the skull, called sutures. They slowly close as we grow older and are gone by age 40. Inside the skull of the victim, the sutures had disappeared. On the outside, they were almost completely gone as well.
Now this would indicate that he was not only 18, but was, middle-aged. You're getting at least 30s, so forth.
Age can be determined another way, by looking at the joint surfaces of the bones. As people age, the body deposits more bone around the joints, causing a condition called arthritic lipping. It begins in the late 20s or early 30s and increases with age. The lipping was consistent with someone in his mid-30s. James Grizzle was 38 years old. Bass next examined the external occipital protuberance, the bulge on the back of the head, to determine the victim's sex. The structure is larger in males than in females. It left Bass with little room for doubt that the victim was male.
This is one of the best ones I've ever seen. This is a classic textbook case of an external occipital protuberance, which would indicate that this individual was a male. So by just this little piece, you could get not only sex, but age with that right there.
From the evidence, Bass determined the victim was a white male in his mid-30s, a description consistent with James Grizzle, but not close enough to hold up in court. To be absolutely positive, Bass relied on Grizzle's dental records.
You have this tooth with a filling that's attached to the tooth after the fire. So we asked the police if they could find from the family a dental record of him. We knew he'd been to the dentist because you could see there were fillings in here.
Bass compared the structure of the tooth and the shape of the root. From Grizzle's dental records, he was able to make his final determination. This was the skeleton of James Grizzle. The teeth provided Bass with a quick and easy way to make a difficult identification. But it was important that he first tried to make the ID using the bones. Otherwise, he'd have no way of knowing if more than one victim was buried in the rubble. If the bones and teeth all suggest the same person, Bass can be confident only one victim was buried there. That person was James Grizzle. Based on this information, Detective Moffat had a case against Leon Williams. It was further bolstered by the discovery that Williams had stolen James Grizzle's truck and forged his checks. Faced with the evidence, Leon Williams confessed. In his confession, he confirmed Bass's careful reconstruction of the crime. He shot James Grizzle in the basement, poured gasoline throughout the house, strapped an explosive to the victim, and when it went off, it set the house on fire. For his crime, Leon Williams was sentenced to life.
If you don't destroy the evidence, if you don't bring in a bulldozer and clean it all off or something like that, the evidence is there. If you know what to look for. It takes you a while, but we were able to reconstruct the events that occurred in this case exactly the way the individual who was charged and convicted said it happened.
William Bass unmasked a killer who went to great lengths to disguise his crime. Elsewhere, a man went to greater lengths to bring the bones of his missing brother back from Guatemala. Guatemala, 1985. A country caught in a civil war between the government and communist guerrillas. In the outlying villages, the government appoints civil patrollers, an armed militia made up of civilians. Everyone must serve 1 day a week. The government provides guns, but no training. It instructs the militia to patrol for communist rebels, but nobody patrols the militia. For hungry young journalists, 1985 was an exciting and dangerous time to be in Guatemala. Freelance American journalist Nick Blake and photographer Griffith Davis underestimated that danger. In their pursuit of a story, they headed into a remote part of the country and vanished. Nick Blake's brother Randy did all he could to uncover what happened.
My brother disappeared in March of '85. I'd been doing requests with the State Department and 4 or 5 other federal agencies who would be in a position to know things, such as the CIA and the National Security Agency and others for ever since, probably 1987.
Randy Blake found only dead ends. Then, a year and a half into his search, he heard an unconfirmed story from an American teacher in a village in Guatemala.
We would go to little fiestas with them and so forth, and he got to know them, and they would talk about the gringos that got killed by the Civil Patrol.
Piecing together the details, the teacher believed the Civil Patrol shot the journalists in 1985. A ravine became their makeshift grave. The Blake family kept pressure on the U.S. and Guatemalan governments to find Nick. To hide the crime, the Civil Patrol retrieved the skeletons and burned them in a raging bonfire. The flames split and shattered the bones beyond all recognition, or at least that's what the patrollers thought. But the Blake family persisted. The patrollers were pressured into sending the remains to the United States. They arrived in 1990, but an analysis uncovered a deception. The crate did not contain human remains. Convinced they had exposed a cover-up, the Blakes and U.S. authorities demanded the truth. Felipe Alva, the regional commander of the Guatemalan Civil Patrol, refused to talk about the incident until the Blakes offered an incentive.
And he was going to be offered a $10,000 reward. And so, but it was going to be paid to him in allotments as he performed along the job.
Enticed by the offer, Alva agreed to send the real remains to the U.S. so long as the family promised not to prosecute.
He came out with a partial unearthing of remains from the site, and he brought them back in 2 boxes, very curious things. They were essentially little caskets, mini caskets, square pine boxes that were velvet lined. And it was the strangest thing because they had dirt in them from the site with little bone chips salted throughout them and so forth, because that's essentially what was remained in my brother and his friend.
The grim homecoming occurred without ceremony at a loading dock behind the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. The unmarked remains had traveled over 3,000 miles to get there. Navigating through a maze of deception and lies. But more work lay ahead before the Blakes could put their loved one to rest and find the closure they sought. This time they had to be certain the bones in the crates were truly Nick's and Griffith's. For the delicate task of identifying the remains, they pinned their hopes on forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley. When the crates arrived, they were x-rayed to see if they required special handling to avoid damage. They contained no surprises. Mostly soil, ash, roots, and bits of bone. Then Owsley and his team sorted the bones. It was immediately apparent the remains were human. They also found a duplication of parts and a color difference. Owsley was certain these were the remains of 2 people. Out of 150 pounds of dirt and debris, they recovered about 2 pounds of incinerated bone. The largest of the more than 1,600 fragments was just 3 inches long. But Owsley was fortunate. Some of the fragments came from the occipital protuberance at the back of the skull. The large size of the specimens indicated both were male. But they could have been almost any 2 men. Then he found a nickel-sized piece of bone that made all the difference. It was a fragment that fits in the forehead and forms a ridge or crest for the sinuses inside the skull. It's called the frontal crest.
Now this is a really unusual configuration of the frontal crest here. Usually this is a solid, prominent ridge, but in a small percentage of the population you can get a double ridge morphology like that. So we had this piece, and based on that, I had a microfilm of an X-ray that was taken of Griffith Davis.
Owsley compared the crest with an X-ray of Davis's head taken after a car accident. The unusual structure of the bone fragment from Guatemala matched the X-ray. But did that prove the fragment came from Davis's skull? Not unless Owsley could first prove that its structure was truly rare. To see how often the crest structure occurred in the general population, Owsley referred to a group of skeletons known as the Terry collection. The more than 1,600 skeletons of the Terry collection were donated for medical research from the 1920s to the 1940s. They represent a cross-section of the population. The medical history of each individual is part of the record. Owsley used the Terry collection to see what percentage of the population shared Davis's frontal crest structure. If only a few people had that bone configuration, and if it was shared by the Guatemala sample and Davis, then Owsley could reasonably conclude the bones could belong to Davis.
If you look at this cranial vault, for instance, one of the things that you've got is here's the cribriform plate, foramen cecum, and then you've got this standard type of frontal crest. And it's a very prominent ridge that occurs in 88% of white males. Now, in contrast, you see how you've got, again, the same structure, but now we've got a double ridge and a groove. This is the type that we see in Griffith Davis's cranium. This occurs 9% of the time.
Davis and the remains from Guatemala shared the same rare anatomical feature. Owsley felt confident the skull fragments could belong to Davis. But were the remaining bones Nick Blake's? The limited sample enabled Owsley to perform only one more test, determining the relative age of the bodies. For this, he relied on the sutures in the skulls. In the specimen that Owsley thought to be Griffith Davis, the sutures showed advanced closure, suggesting a man in his 30s. The sutures on the other remains were still open, indicating a younger man.
So that helped differentiate. The two males were differing in age by about 11 years. And this helped me determine that this is the older person.
At the time of his death, Griffith Davis was 38. Nick Blake was 27. Owsley's calculation was right on the mark. To Randy Blake, Owsley's identification was encouraging, but naggingly inconclusive. If these bones were truly the remains of his brother, he needed to be absolutely sure. As long as a shadow of doubt persisted, the Blakes could not give up their search. But Owsley had reached his limit. He could go no further without more remains.
We said to ourselves, it's probably Nick, but darn it, we want to get up to that site and we want to determine definitely that this is Nick, and let's just make a trip down there. We've got an opportunity.
Going to Guatemala was the only choice the Blakes had if they wanted to honor their brother. but Owsley had to accompany them. Only he could provide the assurance the Blakes had waited so long for. Together, they would retrace the final steps of Nicholas Blake and Griffith Davis. With forensic anthropologist Doug Owsley's help, Randy Blake felt he was close to finding his brother. He knew that the only way to claim Nick's remains was to retrieve them himself. Randy, his brother Sam, Owsley, and a colleague made the trip to Guatemala in June 1992. There, they met Regional Civil Patrol Commander Felipe Alva. He took them to the remote mountain location of the remains. But Owsley wasn't buying it.
I take my trowel and do a little scraping. I cut down to about 15 centimeters, and I come up and say, this is the wrong site. I say, there's not enough ash, there's no bone fragments here, there's none of the red soil that I'm looking for. I just looked at this, all of this 2 containers a couple months before, and there's none of the roots that were found in any of that.
Then, sheepishly, Alva's assistant reached under a log and removed a green plastic bag that contained a handful of human bone fragments and some soil.
And in this 8 ounces of soil, it's got the right color, it's got the charcoal, it's got root fragments. And I say, this is from the right site. And he says, I got it right here.
The assistant told them these were the last of the remains. The Americans demanded to see where they came from.
We went back to our little hotel in Nabob, and we basically grilled Felipe Alva for 3 hours that night with a Guatemalan colonel, U.S. Embassy defense attaché, U.S. Army colonel, a couple of other people in the room, and basically sat him and said, Alva, you lied to us.
Under duress, Felipe Alva agreed to take the team to a site he swore was the actual location of the remains. When they arrived 2 days later, Owsley looked it over with a skeptic's eye.
We could see the indentation where the soil had been taken out. We worked it around the perimeters, and we found a lot of things. One of the things we found lots of was metal. Well, here's part of an eyeglass frame, part of the eyeglass piece in the frame, and it's a circular type of pattern. And it's just one of the things that when we first picked it up, one of the brothers of this man said, that looks like his glasses. So we knew that we were in a very significant spot.
Now certain they had the right spot, the team collected all they could and headed home.
It was almost like tailor-made for Doug Owsley. I mean, it was so perfect because he we were so lucky to have him in that one day, because clearly a deception was planned and was being executed, clearly. And he just totally blew it out of the water by being there and allowed us to have the ammunition to get this guy to come clean.
Among the bones Doug Owsley carried back with him were fragments of a shattered jawbone. They still held some of the teeth and all the roots. They would enable him to make a direct comparison to Blake's dental records.
From the dental records that we had of him in life, we knew that he had impacted third molars. And they had come in at an angle where the third molar had bumped into the second and had gotten locked up. And so what it had actually done is wore a contact or a wear facet into the side of the second molar. And it had a very distinctive root associated with it.
From the shape of the teeth and roots, Owsley was able to positively identify Nick Blake. For the Blake family, it marked the end of a grueling, emotional ordeal. Now they could grieve Nick's loss and give his remains a proper burial.
That meant everything, to repatriate his remains and bring them back and bury them in a cemetery and give them a grave marker, which we did.
Not enough remains of Blake or Davis were recovered to confirm they were shot. For the Blakes and the Davises, that was no longer important. Bringing Nick and Griffith home was enough. From the ashes of murder rise lingering clues, transformed but never erased. As scientists learn to read their meaning, they can restore what the fire has taken. and by doing so, find a loved one or catch a killer.